Welcome to DIA Today, Democracy in America Today. I'm Matt Parks alongside David Corbin. Glad to have you with us as we explore the ideas behind today's headlines.
My left eye sees pollution. Those dirty fuels are burning. The earth's whole climate's churning. Clean energy solution. My right eye scans the bill. Fossil fuels are cheap. Wind and solar too steep. Drill, baby, drill. Predefined, misaligned, polarized division. Shuttered mind, worse than blind. 2020
Hey there, Dave.
vision.
Doing well, Matt. Good afternoon. A little later start to our show production, but all good. Yeah, looking forward to Christmas,
Yeah,
which would be, what, 5 days away, 6 days away from today?
1 week from today. 1 week
One
from
week from
today.
today.
Yeah,
Okay. There's still time to order Amazon and get
I
presents
know,
in. There
which
you
is a
go.
good thing. I got in a bad habit back in the day when I was teaching at UNH and single of pretty much not thinking about Christmas until I turned in my final grades. And in
Yep.
those days, I was often pretty late. I was like 21st, 22nd, and I'd be heading down to my parents'. And so after I turned in my grades, I would go to the mall there in
Fox
Portsmouth.
Run Mall. Yeah.
Yep. And that was like my one mall trip a year. And I would
Okay.
go there and I just I'd stay until I had everything,
Okay.
and then I was done. But yeah, when you're doing the Amazon thing, even with Amazon, you want to have a little bit of lead time just in case.
I think you need about a week. For those of our listeners who are married, I read this great kind of funny, unfunny article yesterday that a lot of dads or husbands fail to get stuffing stockers for their, or stocking stuffers, I should say. I don't even know how to say it, for their wives. So oftentimes everyone else's stocking is stuffed and the wife loses out. So
Yeah.
I got right on to Amazon after that and
Okay.
ordered, which
Yeah.
are coming in tomorrow. So
That's one of my things. I tend to go to like local dollar store or wherever to get the stocking stuffers. It's gotten more difficult because there's so many food restrictions these days. It used to be, you just get some chocolates and, some whatever other candy kind of things. And we can't really do that too much. So it's gotten a little bit more challenging, but yeah, I still enjoy kind of doing that role and try to find at least something for the kids and for Rachel. So,
the only problem for us is that we have a birthday December 15th. Our daughter Eliza
oh
just turned
yeah,
14 a couple
yeah,
days ago. And then we have Jack, who's January 2nd. So
coming
we're
up.
kind of
Yeah,
bookend,
right.
with Christmas in the middle.
You got a lot
But
going on.
there's a really great celebration going on that I know that you'll be at this weekend. Pastor Steve Magee from Exeter Presbyterian, a
Yep.
great friend, just great human being, is retiring there. So you're looking
Yeah.
forward to that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. 31 years in the pulpit there, founded the church. Yeah, I'm really excited to be there, have a chance to say a few words at the reception on Saturday. So that's going to be fun. His last Sunday services. He's doing Christmas Eve, I believe, as well. So we won't be there for the final service. But yeah, it's going to be great to be back with old friends there and really be able to celebrate. What an amazing ministry, certainly absolutely transformative in my life. And yeah, want to be able to celebrate that.
Yeah, I was fortunate when we went back to New England for Thanksgiving. I just popped in the church to see if he was there, and he was there, and he's just Steve, right? And he smiles, and
Yeah.
it's just there's so much Christ in that man that it's
Yeah.
just great to be around him. So
Yeah. Absolutely.
wish him my best and the best from the Corbins. He's also been just a great inspiration and pastor for us as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, good. We've made it to the end, Dave, of our study of this book in honor of our late mentor, Dr. Angelo Codevilla. And so we looked at chapter 5 last week, and we're going to do a bit of a recap there and then move ahead this week, chapter 6, which is another focus on foreign policy, on common sense and missile defense, but some broader themes there as well in terms of how Dr. Codevilla thought about foreign affairs and the challenges that he saw on the American scene as our political elites really didn't apply the same framework that he had learned from the founders, from Lincoln, from others earlier in our history. So I think a lot of stuff to talk about. I think it builds nicely on our discussion last week. So why don't we start with a bit of a recap there and we'll go from there.
Sure. So last week we covered David Goldman's chapter, Angelo Codevilla's Failure and Ours. And I think there's really a tragic irony in the chapter itself, and that is that as wise and prudent and as much of a statesman as Angelo Codevilla was, he and those who followed him were, according to Goldman, unable to establish themselves as kind of the legitimate leaders of the American people. So I think the key word, I don't even know we used it a couple weeks back, legitimacy, is something that the ruling class always seems to have a hold on,
Hmm.
even if their policies don't make sense. So, this tension between what you might call common sense and elite nonsense, uh,
Yeah.
and the fact that those who practice elite nonsense are very good at presenting themselves as the legitimate authority. So, how can you overcome their legitimacy? And one of the things that Goldman says is that one way that this might have happened had Codeville been able to produce a cohort of people who were capable of exercising power and were prudent, et cetera, and that they could then, as a excuse me, present themselves as kind of the legitimate standard bearers of American statecraft. The ruling class, it's argued, I think even Codevilla would agree with this, was able to continue its hold on American foreign policy long after its greatest disappointments, its reaction to 9/11, et cetera, proved to be wrong. Finally, I think the interesting question that we brought up in our last episode is, would a better plan of attack for Codevilla had been to kind of work within that intelligence apparatus and kind of given it some independence and clarity. And I think we both argued that this while it might have been a possibility, I don't think it would have been an open and shut case because he may have been able to get himself into that position, but from there, I don't think he'd be able to reform that ruling class. So, we're left with his legacy as kind of a critic from the outside. I think someone who was rightly able to tell us what was wrong about what was being done. But if Goldman is correct, he was never able to create a following that was capable of ruling in place of that ruling class. What do you
Yeah, and
take from?
obviously that's a lot to put on one person, right? I mean, and there's no way that he could have done that had he dedicated every moment of his life to creating such a group of people and the institutions around it. It would take other institutions, other people who are capable of joining an enterprise. And of course, he found many allies, let's say in the Claremont Institute and other places like that. And think about Claremont as somewhere where there was an attempt to establish kind of an alternate university sort of structure, right? And not necessarily, strictly speaking, a university, but nevertheless, serious about ideas and the various fellowships that Claremont created, continues to fund and to sponsor, trying to get people educated in the ideas of Lincoln and Publius and the speechwriters now, and they've got one I think for military folks, and so thinking about different aspects of what it would take to get people well educated and thoughtfully framed, and so that they're actually able to, in positions often of authority, right? These are people that are, usually early on, but promising and often have some positions where they could see the prospects of further advancement. And so trying to help them along the way intellectually. And also, I think you might say by creating cohorts of people, right, who know
Yeah.
each other in a network where you don't feel like you're the only person. You've got that person down the hall who was also a Publius fellow maybe 2 years before you were, or was a Lincoln fellow a couple years after you were. And so kind of that building of network. And, and ISI is trying to do some things like that. There's some other institutions perhaps that have done that. It's 10 people at a time. It's 12 people at a time. Is that enough? Can do you need thousands perhaps ultimately in order to fill these positions? But I think that's certainly one institution that Dr. Codevilla was very closely allied with and associated with, and is a force multiplier. Now, not everything Claremont has done in the Trump era, I think, was as wisely done as some other things, but nevertheless, I think there's still an effort to try to build the apparatus, the framework necessary to have an alternate regime ready to take over offices and to take the need for real statesmanship seriously.
Yeah, I would agree that this is a work in progress, and I would also agree that I think Claremont's done, a very good job of trying to create that cohort. I think one of the questions that I would have is, you have that cohort of probably now graduates of these different programs, 2,000 individuals. Are they in a position where they can not only do the job that's at hand, kind of within the institutions, but can they connect why they're doing what they're doing with the American people? So, how do you move from a
Right.
cohort of people who think correctly about these matters to what I would call a society of individuals who think correctly about these matters, and having that intermediary between these prospective leaders and the people, I think, would be essential to fulfilling that task. And I've suggested that at points to their leadership, but still things are, and always maybe moving in that direction. But I think they've done a good job, as you said, in trying to extend someone like Codevilla's intellectual legacy. And certainly the publication of this book is a perfect or prime example of that, kind of getting his thought out there, I think
Right.
is a good start. So, which brings us to today's chapter. And Brian Kennedy is the author of the chapter. Brian, at one time, was president of the Claremont Institute, someone who had worked a lot, primarily in the realm of missile defense. Was a huge fan of Codevilla. Very much enjoyed him. I think as a person, colleague, as a manly man, and Brian's chapter on Codevilla, I think is very celebratory of what Codevilla was trying to do on some of these important matters like missile defense and how we look at our geopolitical situation around the
Hmm.
world. So why don't we get into that chapter then? And how does Kennedy begin the chapter, Matt? And what is his overall argument?
Yeah, so the title of the chapter, once again, is Angelo Codevilla, Common Sense and Missile Defense. And so really it uses missile defense and some of the efforts that Dr. Codevilla made back in the late 70s, early 80s, especially with the Reagan administration, 82, 83, in that period of time, as really an example of a broader approach to foreign policy, which was grounded in common sense. And so the thesis was that and for the last several decades, America has not been a serious country when it came to foreign policy. And really, that might be true of the whole post Cold War era. That's not been serious, and yet, this was not something that he attributed to the American people per se, but rather to the ruling class and the leaders who were concerned about their standing, who were concerned about kind of consensus and maintaining elite pieties, but really weren't thoughtful when it came to sort of basic ways of analyzing foreign affairs and thinking about very simple questions like, well, what's the best thing for the American people in this situation? What's the best way to achieve a good and lasting peace, a just and lasting peace, to borrow the language of Lincoln in one of his book titles? How do we do that in this particular context? And so, we've talked about this throughout the series that Dr. Codevilla was always going back to those fundamental questions, always going back to first principles. I mean, he was a great Aristotelian, a great student of Aristotle, and always wanted to know why, what's the end in view, and wasn't satisfied if the answer was fuzzy or it was bad. And that was the problem, as he saw it, with American political, with the American elite when it came to foreign policy, that they never really asked those questions. They never pushed further than their own perhaps class interests, their own kind of general frameworks that they had accepted without really any critical analysis. And as a consequence, what's the bottom line in all this? That's a very Codevilla type of question. America was less secure and less free than she otherwise would be.
Yeah, as you're talking, Matt, I can I'm picturing Codevilla's clenched big white teeth, shaking his head, like,
No, 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 no.
the grunt, the caveman grunts,
Yeah,
with,
but
the lack of seriousness and kind of making the connection between means and ends.
yeah.
we've had him on the show a couple times. I think the question that I would have just from the beginning of Kennedy's chapter, and he would sometimes not answer the question when you asked it when you posed it to him. Well, how can you have a country that's not serious, but a people who are serious, who are good, who are moral, and who do possess common sense? There seems to be a disconnect there. And what is the connection between the people who seemingly are serious, good, moral, and possess common sense, and their leaders who do not possess those same qualities? Can you have both? Is it just simply a situation where that disconnect is produced by a ruling elite that ignores or sets aside what the people want? But that, I mean, asking that question, I think, is an important question to ask to Codevilla, because you don't get to where we are democratically without the people having some role and some responsibility in why we are what we are.
Right. We can't avoid the fact that our leaders are those whom we have chosen. And although there may be more to the story than that, there's not less to the story than that. And so, yeah, there's a challenge there. And I think, you know, where do we see the common sense of the American people with sort of that gut level reaction to stuff that ain't right, those kinds of things. I think it's one of the most difficult places to apply that kind of gut level common sense, though, is to foreign affairs, because there's some obvious expertise that's required. You've got to understand some history. You've got to understand some geography. You've got to understand some science, as we talked about last time. And so I think there's maybe a certain level of modesty and maybe a certain level of disinterest. Right? Americans have been famous for taking a great deal of interest in foreign affairs. That leads to a greater measure of deference when it comes to these things. Why is President Trump in trouble right now, it seems, politically? Well, because prices haven't come down. Because he's telling people, hey, it's not that bad. And they're looking at their bank account and saying, yeah, it is. I thought it was going to get better. Now, maybe it was an unrealistic expectation because, inflation is one of those things. Once it's gone up by 10%, it's coming down, right? It's going to go up by 3% more and 2% on top of that. And maybe eventually you catch up. But, once you've gone up by 10%, there's no going back. So maybe the expectations were unrealistic. But the point is, Americans get that, right? They get the economy because they feel the economy. They experience the economy. They see it in themselves. They see it in their neighbors. Foreign affairs are much more abstract. And so it's much more natural, and again, maybe in some ways proper, to have a certain kind of deference, right, to those who seem to be informed about foreign affairs, because we feel like, well, we don't really know the details of the situation, and we have some gut level instinct of what's good for America and those kind of things, but that only goes so far in terms of the actual policy, right? We know at a basic level, put America first, to use that language, but what does it actually mean? How do we operationalize that? And that's the challenge I think the American people have found over the post-Cold War era, where there's not an obvious we win, they lose. Reagan's summary of the Cold War aim. What is the post-Cold War version of that? Right? Who's we win, who loses? Who has to lose for us to win?
I agree up to a point with what you're saying. However, I do think in here, like I'll reference a book that if you ever want to read a great history of American foreign policy and how it's connected to the American way of life, I would recommend Walter McDougall's Promised Land Crusader State, in which he said, like, the Old Testament of American foreign policy was simply put, in America first meant America aiming toward becoming and remaining a promised land, where after the turn into the 20th century, we begin to buy into the siren's call to become a crusader state. So this question of the American identity and what is the purpose of America pivots to a great degree from the 17th, 18th, and 19th century to the 20th and now 21st century. And we embrace the idea that perhaps it is our role to, in Wilson's terms, to make peace for all time, or to rightly, fight foreign enemies who are truly evil and represent imbalanced regimes. But once you get used to feasting off of that plate, it's really difficult to see whether or not those policies amount to an America first policy. And I'm not suggesting here, Matt, that the answer is some ignorant isolationism where we can kind of remain separate from everything that's going on in the world.
Hmm.
But I think there's a difference between isolationism and internationalism, and kind of a false dichotomy there where, we truly ask in Codevillan and Aristotelian terms, what is it that we can accomplish as a country? And to do that unilaterally, to maintain American independence by being independent, that's very difficult to present to the American people today and have them kind of wrap their arms fully around it, or at least a good portion of the American people. So you can have all the common sense in the world, but
Hmm.
if you identify with a country whose aim is to fight foreign crusades to some degree, you're going to continue to uh, play the crusader. So anyway,
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, you're right. I think as an analysis of where many Americans are, and I think this is partly a result of the emergence of the sort of information technology. Think about the different waves of that. We know what's going on in other places in the world, and so the burden of being a great power and thinking, well, look, if we're willing to spend $10 billion, couldn't we save people of Eastern Ukraine from a horrible fate of being taken over by Russia? Why wouldn't we do that? I mean, those kind of questions naturally arise, and then you take it from Ukraine to somewhere else, right? Somewhere in Africa where there's a famine taking place, or where there's some kind of genocide taking place, and why couldn't we? And remember, of course, the McDougall book, the last chapter is on global militarism, and the three big questions, or the three big themes are, what we can do, we should do, we must do, right? If you have the capacity to do X, Y, or Z, then you very quickly move to the moral imperative to do it. And so I think that's something that's been compelling to a certain point to the American people. I think there is a recognition, certainly post Iraq War, post Afghanistan, right, that can go very wrong. Right, that is not just a matter of throwing American power at a problem, committing a certain number of troops or a certain amount of money, because obviously in those cases you had large commitments that didn't accomplish the stated ends. So I think there's very much a skepticism about that today than there was certainly 25 years ago. But yeah, I mean, you're right. There's still this sense of the crusade. There's still a sense of, where there's injustice around the world, that's our responsibility. And that was something very much at odds with the early American foreign policy that John Quincy Adams, George Washington, Lincoln, and others represented.
yeah, and I think if not to beat a dead horse, but if there's a person who is central to this story, he's the intersection of this Old Testament and New Testament. It's the person of TR, who
Hmm.
I had many arguments with Dr. Codevilla about, whether or not it was a good thing to kind of follow TR's lead. And I think that Codevilla just embraced TR's manliness and like,
Right.
let's get this done. It's American, right? And we can do it. So let's do it. And there's some argument to be made there that, I mean, we ought to embrace that manliness. But then I was posed to him here. I was always the one who liked to take on the bully in the schoolyard, but you can very easily become tempted to become a bully yourself after you beat up on the bullies, which I think, on the point of what we're talking about here, might draw you away from common sense and might draw you away from the term that now defines American foreign policy, at least within the Trump administration, what it means to actually practice an America first foreign policy.
Yeah, so let's try to talk through that a little bit. I mean, this is one of those situations where there's, I think, a good opportunity to get some practical application and think about, what does America First look like? How does it apply? How wasn't it applied? Let's say 9/11. We've talked about that a little bit already, but we can think about that in terms of missile defense. We can think about that in terms of Russia, Ukraine, some other contemporary applications. Let's walk through that a little bit.
Well, I think it all begins with the Declaration of Independence, one in the course of human events. So that's the starting point. So one in the course of human events, right? It becomes necessary for people to disassociate themselves with the regime that they're part of and to establish a new regime. there's a basis upon which they establish that new regime. And in the American sensibility and common sense, it's to defend the liberty of the American people. And that's why we have a nation. That's why the Constitution is constructed as such. It's why the executive is given a certain amount of power and authority over foreign policy, why the legislative branch, as representing the will of the people, can chime in on these matters. But at the end of the day, America declared independence for America and the American way of life and what America thought was a just peace that it wanted to live. So that involves, in part, securing itself. It involves, in part, wanting to be a commercial republic and being prosperous and allowing people to work and to exchange and to make things and to invent and do all these things. I think, in a word, America First, as understood by the American founders, is not simply what's good for the American people, which is important, but what is just as well. So what is good mixed with what is just, mixed with what is lawful, played out in international affairs.
And I think that one of the things, when you first hear that, it sounds like it's selfish, right? That's kind of the moral critique of it. That's the moral power of internationalism is it's not selfish. Wilson and his crusades sounded noble, right? We want to make the world safe for democracy. We want to restore the natural borders to various nations and allow each people to have their own nation. All those sounds like noble projects. And there's a certain kind of millenarianism associated with that. We've talked about that before, so they certainly have to think about that element of it. But I think it's also important to recapture the moral argument that was really at the heart of the founders' vision here. So it wasn't just a matter of hard-headed selfishness. You could read Pacificus #4, which was a Hamilton essay back in the debates over the executive power and the role of the president in declaring neutrality. When France is at war with all of Europe, basically, and Washington says America is neutral, there were those who thought, no, that's not right. We have a treaty with France. We should honor that treaty. And Hamilton wrote a series of essays defending the Neutrality Proclamation. But in the process of that, he writes in Pacificus #4, this idea of the grounding of consent at the heart of this project. And so why is it that the American government's job is to protect the American people? Well, because the American people gave them that job, right? It's not the leaders' proper role to decide what should the American people do abroad. It's the people's job to elect leaders to protect them and protect their rights, and to do that in a way that's consistent with their commitment to government by the consent of the governed. And so what would it mean for us to go to other nations and to try to establish liberty for them? Well, contrary to their own opportunity to give consent, right? Not the same thing as establishing liberty for yourself and building the internal institutions and habits of self-government. And so their argument wasn't that this is just about, it's kind of selfish, doing what's good for us, looking out for number one, but that it was really a way of modeling self-government to the world, that if we are governed ourselves by leaders of our own choosing, we consent to that government, and they do the things that we give them the power to do, we want to give other nations the same opportunity to do the same thing. And they're not really going to establish their own framework for self-government if we try to impose it upon them. It simply doesn't work that way. They don't grow out of this tutelage into something other than what they were under our instruction. And so I think it's important, to understand that the argument here is not a rejection of morality, if you will, in foreign policy, but a morality grounded in moral realism and grounded in the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the founding more broadly.
Yeah, and I think best summarized, and this is Hamiltonian thought at work, in Washington's farewell address, where he says to the American people, "The unity of government which constitutes you one people is also now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is a main pillar in the edifice of your real independence, the support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize. But as it is easy to foresee that from different causes and from different quarters, much pains will be taken, many artifices employed to weaken in your minds the conviction of this truth," right? To get you off the mark, as to why you became a country in the first place. Now, of course, later on in that same address, Washington states in the clearest terms what America's position is regarding the rest of the world. I mean, here he takes it up within the context of what those artifices that might undermine our love of country would be. And he talks about faction here, but then he talks about foreign influences. And so, what is our proper orientation to the rest of the world? And these great words: observe good faith and justice towards all nations, cultivate peace and harmony with all. Religion and morality enjoin this conduct. Exactly what you were just saying about this is not selfishness. Religion and morality enjoin this conduct. And can it be that good policy does not equally enjoin it? It will be worthy of a free, enlightened, and at no distant period, a great nation to give to mankind the magnanimous and too novel example of a people always guided by an exalted justice and benevolence. Selfishness? No. The example of a people guided by the right things.
Yeah, that's right. And so, he hopes that in time, following that policy, will lead America to the point where he says we may choose peace or war as our interest guided by justice shall counsel. Right? That's the fundamental freedom of a nation internationally, to be able to choose peace or war as our interest guided by justice shall counsel.
Right. So America first, guided by justice, right? If you add on that end. And I think that when injustice happens to you, as it often does in this world, and here Brian Kennedy mentions 9/11, how do you respond to an injustice like that? It would become very easy to view all further policy from the perspective of what happened on that awful morning of September 11th, 2001. But if we do so at the expense of losing sight of what happened at the end of the 18th century and what we were originally positioned to do, then we become a nation that has a new declaration of dependence on things that are happening internationally than independence and working kind of unilaterally with the world at large.
So how would Dr. Codevilla have done post 9/11 differently? We talked about this a little bit, but let's talk about that in some more specifics. What were the things that, had he been at the helm, America would have done or not done after 9/11?
Number one, who is responsible for this attack? Number two, kill them. Number three, make sure that when you kill them, you let any other person who wants to commit something similar to that act know that they will be killed swiftly. End of story. Secondly, I think internally, continue to live your way of life, continue to live your peace, but don't overturn your society and now become a society that in which you do exactly what your enemy wants you to do and become less American in doing so, and change your way of life. This stupid thing that you always see in the subway. If you see something, say something. Just
Right.
That's not American. Doesn't represent our resilience. It doesn't represent our grit when we're at our best. So take on the enemy, identify the enemy, take them on, but always do so with a clear sense of what your peace is, what the peace that you desire is. I think expressed it as Washington said it 250 years ago.
Yeah, and so I think in this case, as Kennedy mentions, the party that wasn't really accounted for was Saudi Arabia, right? Had supplied and trained and given shelter to essentially every one of those who were involved in the attacks. And of course, we went after Osama bin Laden and the Taliban in Afghanistan, went after Saddam Hussein, but Saudi Arabia, for various historical reasons of alliance and whatever, right, was able to avoid the consequences of their actions in that case.
Well, and then we take up instead this goal of nation building that we're
Right.
going to all of a sudden create democratic nations abroad, not realizing that for a democratic nation to live at peace with itself, it has to have a long history. There has to be kind of an organic development of a democratic republic. It doesn't happen overnight. Even if you kill leaders of an imbalanced regime, the ability that you have to go into a foreign culture and make it a replicant of what you are, or some level of a replicant of what you are, is an impossible task. Never mind, I think, fighting a global war on terror rather than identifying a subject, a terrorist, and fighting a war on a terrorist rather than a global war on terror. Can we fight a global war on evil?
Right.
No, but if someone evil does something evil to you, you have a responsibility to your regime to hold that person accountable. So just the lack of a use of a dictionary, the lack of a correlation with reality, with human anthropology, with what the limits of politics are, these are things that Codevilla would have been thinking about and was thinking about and writing about after 9/11, but they were set aside. And I've used this expression before. They were set aside because what becomes predominant at this time is elite nonsense rather than common sense.
So the example that was given most discussion in the book was missile defense, and so I think it's worth talking through the ways that missile defense illustrates this approach to foreign policy, the lack of seriousness by the American elite, and the commitment to defending America and America first by Dr. Codevilla. So let's talk about that a little bit. What was the prevailing way of thinking about missile defense when Reagan comes to office? Well, basically, it's laid out there in the ABM Treaty of 1972, which basically required the two nations to be vulnerable to attack. So you're allowed to protect your national capital, and you're allowed to protect one missile site. And so the theory is mutually assured destruction, right? MAD, which was the underlying idea that the best way to preserve the peace was for both nations to live in absolute fear of nuclear annihilation. And I remember that, growing up in the early 80s, mid 80s, we thought about that. There were movies on TV, The Day After. I don't know if you remember that one, but that it was an event, right? Talking about what's it like the day after a nuclear attack, and you thought about what those consequences would be like, and that was intentional. Right? We were supposed to be scared, and Dr. Codevilla, along with President Reagan and others, said, "Should we be scared? Is that actually the way, or shouldn't our goal be to deliver Americans from that fear, so that they can live in the kind of peace and security that their Declaration and Constitution promised?"
Yeah, and here Kennedy chimes in, and I think this is great capturing of Codevilla's mindset. Quote, guided by the Aristotelian observation that everything is done for a purpose, Codevilla's strategic common sense was thus: nations build a military capable of waging war. They do so for a purpose. The purpose is either to make war for a strategic end or to deter other nations from making war against them. So that quote, in the context of Soviet nuclear ambitions and the Soviet effort to build up their nuclear arsenal, well, we're still tied to this treaty. So Codevilla's response is, what's a common sense response to an enemy regime that's building up its nuclear arsenal? Find a way to defend yourself against that nuclear arsenal.
Right. And so in the early 80s, he pushed hard on Senate Intelligence Committee staff in support of SDI. And of course, President Reagan made big announcements, 82, 83, about that. That, as we've read, documents from the Soviet Union had a profound effect on Soviet thinking and planning. They were very concerned about the possibility of the United States developing this technology. And it was certainly one of the pieces of the puzzle, and ultimately the bankruptcy, certainly financial as well as moral, of the Soviet regime. And yet, as Kennedy points out, as we've talked about before, here we are 40 years on, and we don't have missile defense. So nothing like what Ronald Reagan laid out for us in a vision back in 83.
Yeah, and I mean, this applies to really every level of human life. If you live in a place where you can't defend yourself, who benefits from that situation? The criminal. But if the
Right.
criminal knows, right, that if they go into a house and someone is armed, there's going to be a consequence for their action. The criminal has a real clear sense of what seriousness is in, the consequences of their action, and they also know when there's unseriousness there. So I think the point that you make about the Soviet regime, falling under a new pressure that the Americans may build SDI, it really went a long way to its demise.
Yeah.
Um, so I mean, common sense applied in a serious way produces its own legitimacy.
And you recall the howling of the American elite after Reykjavik when Reagan was there with Gorbachev and talking about actually getting rid of entire nuclear arsenals. And the last stipulation insisted upon by Gorbachev was that Reagan drop SDI.
Yep.
And Reagan said, I'm not going to do that. I have an obligation to defend the American people. And the New York Times went absolutely nuts, as did all the conventional elite opinion. Oh, you mean you're not willing to make peace with the Soviet Union once and for all, give up SDI, which is only a pipe dream, which is infeasible project that only a true barbarian could love, and yet Reagan had that deep-seated understanding of his job as president and protecting the American people. And of course, he got the last laugh 3 years later when the Berlin Wall came down, and 2 years after that, the Soviet Union collapsed under the weight, as you said, of the pressure that he applied through things like SDI and his refusal to cut deals that would have looked good in the headlines, but not actually secured the peace of the American people.
Exactly. And I think we could just, what would be a similar response to the geopolitical threats that are at play today? And the questioning of are they truly threats and to what degree are they threats? And how do you respond to those threats? So, what we're talking about here is the presentation of an America first, America just approach to international affairs. How does that idea apply, say, Matt, to China and Taiwan today? Kennedy brings up the China Taiwanese issue in the book.
Yeah, very interesting that I think yesterday, President Trump approved $11 billion in sale of armaments, weapons to Taiwan to try to shore up their defenses. It's obvious in the last few years that China is taking steps, incremental steps, but certainly clear steps toward an invasion of Taiwan. And we know this is a matter of great national interest to the Chinese. And yet, you might want, well, does America have an interest in protecting Taiwan? Kennedy was convinced that America did. Codevilla was convinced that America did, because, of course, this is a major part of our trade, throughout the Pacific region. The free movement on the waterways around Taiwan, including Japan and South Korea, other allies there. These are serious American interests. And China clearly has a hegemonic view of their role in that region and wants to be able to dictate terms of who can and cannot move about freely in the Pacific Ocean. So it's always been understood by the United States that the freedom of the seas is a profound American interest from the standpoint of our security as well as our prosperity. And so the protection of Taiwan and doing what we can to give them a fighting chance against China is something that Codevilla saw as a vital American interest, not because we were committed to the continuation of the pre-communist regime, which of course fled to Taiwan, and that's sort of the origins of this whole story, but because it was what was necessary for the security of American good.
Yeah, so I think that's a good first step, but we have to continue down that road of showing the Chinese that we're serious about defending our interests in that theater. And if we
Right.
don't, then the Chinese aren't stupid. They're going to know that we're unprepared and they're going to act accordingly. So this is just what human beings do. This is what regimes do.
Right.
No matter all the talk that you use and how the fluffy language is, what's the reality of the situation? And most nations are pretty clued in to what reality is, and they act on that basis. So why wouldn't we do the same?
Right. And the drawing down of our naval power over the last several decades is a matter of serious concern, especially as China has been building up their naval power.
A couple other questions come to mind here because they're in the news every day. How does this policy apply to Russia and Ukraine, and how does the policy apply to Venezuela? Do you think those are different situations, Matt? What would we do in those situations, or what should we do from a Codevillian, Washingtonian mindset?
Well, of course, the old way of thinking about political affairs was very geographic.
Yep.
And so early American leaders said, look, what's happening in the Americas is happening in our backyard.
What is
And
nearer is dearer. What is
that's right.
nearer is dearer. Yep.
That's right. And so what happens in Venezuela is significant. Now, does that require us to be pushing for regime change? Does that require us to be involved in interdicting drugs in this way or that way? I mean, those are all practical questions that follow from that. But certainly the presence of hostile regimes nearby who are leveraging oil in order to prop themselves up and then to support other hostile regimes like Cuba, et cetera, that's a matter of great national interest. And so, again, we could talk about different ways to approach that, right? Different strategies and tactics that might be called for in those situations. But that was certainly the framework they would use. And so Ukraine is a long way away. Now, America's interests have certainly expanded. We were just talking about interest in the Pacific. Right? Taiwan's a long way away too. But so it's necessary to think about, how does that all fit together? And if Russia is successful in conquering parts of Ukraine or all of Ukraine, what does that mean for allies that are nearer and dearer to the United States? So these are not questions that are just easily answered by getting out the atlas and measuring the distance from capital to capital. But nevertheless, these are ways we have to think about this, and we have to consider, what is the fundamental strategic interest the United States has at stake in the independence of Ukraine, and how much effort should we put into preserving that interest?
Yeah, and there are reasons I think to go to war that I don't think are central to the defense of the American way of life. I mean, you can go to Venezuela and you can rightly argue, okay, perhaps that regime is illegitimate. Is that a reason to go to war in Venezuela? Perhaps there's some terrible things happening in a humanitarian front there, but there are terrible things happening across the globe on a humanitarian front.
Right.
There are a lot of illegitimate regimes. Are we entering into, intervening on behalf of peoples in those regimes because there's definitely a lot of evil out there? Or in the case of Venezuela, as you were mentioning, is regional stability at stake here? Is there a national security issue? Is the reality that Venezuela may be inviting in those who are not friends of the United States in their backyard, and hence there's more hostility toward our country? Okay, that may be a very good reason to take a strong interest in what's happening there. And I think the same applies to Russia and Ukraine. Is this something simply where we're trying to protect Ukraine's national sovereignty or our credibility, or do we have something really clear and present to fear in the Russian regime?
And I guess the other thing I would say, that Dr. Codevilla was also very clear that once you identify the threat, you make the full effort to eliminate the threat. I remember the watchword in the early Biden administration was always escalation. We want to avoid escalation. And that's a great way of also avoiding victory, because the way that you win wars is by escalating beyond the point that your opponent is willing to and able to escalate, right? Where you throw more force at them than they can handle. And so I understand the fear. Okay, we don't want to get a nuclear exchange with Russia. Got it. But there's also the danger of trying to calibrate, right? This was the thing. It was just enough money and munitions to keep Ukraine fighting, but not enough for them to actually win the war. And we're going to have this thing so fine-tuned, the social scientists and the defense contractors and everybody have it all figured out that we can get it just so, and then get the outcome that we're able to sort of dial up the way we would desire. And really, the point of fighting wars, as Codeville would always say, is victory, because victory alone brings peace, and peace is the thing you're trying to achieve for your own people.
Yeah, you can't set aside half of your means to achieve an end. Now, half
Right.
measures don't work in achieving ends. So if you've determined, right, that this is an end or an objective that you need to achieve, you go with it with all the means that you have. This policy of half measures, I think, is incredibly problematic, and I think leads the other side, as we've been saying over and over again in this conversation, to think that you're unserious. You're not serious about victory. You're not serious about defending your own peace. And if your opponent knows that, they've got a great advantage over you.
Well, that's going to wrap up our consideration of this book. It's been a great conversation. I really appreciate, Dave, you making your contribution to it and this book, Claremont Institute publishing it. I think it's great to have a chance to reflect over these weeks on the legacy of Dr. Codevilla and think about how the ideas that he stood for and taught, broadly speaking, continue to apply and the guidance that they have for us. Obviously, there's a lot of work to do and institutions to build and people to train and all the rest. But he was always optimistic, as we've talked about, and so I think his message would be, well, shoulder to the plow, get on with
Yep.
it, get on with it. Don't
Yeah.
waste your time and don't complain, but just get hustling.
Yep. Reality is real. Common sense is sensible. Apply common sense to reality. And you don't always get what you want, but you probably get the most optimal conclusion to any event, to any nation's history.
All right, well, let's transition to the Tocqueville's crystal ball. We are in heavily in the college football season right now. So last time we predicted the 4 championship games for the Power Four conferences, and Dave, you nailed them. You did it based on the interest of Notre Dame, and that worked very well, except that Notre Dame still got left out of the playoff. But nevertheless, you were 4-0. I was 2-2, so congratulations for your victory there. Pyrrhic victory in a way, I guess, but victory nonetheless.
It's an injustice. I might even say crime. It was a criminal activity.
Criminal activity.
Maybe that's hyperbole, but you have to wonder. I mean, you win 10 games in a row. You lose by a couple points to teams that are going into the playoff, very early in the season. It's what's going to lead to is just what we used to have, which is, Alabama playing Jacksonville State August 25th of every year or September 2nd, and then, having this pushover schedule, up until when they have to play conference teams. So either that or, within 4 years, the college football playoff will be like the March tournament with 32 teams. Which is, I mean, the fact that, in this round of games, you have number 20 Tulane and number 24 James Madison playing. I'm sorry for those who are rooting for those schools, but does anyone believe that either one of those schools has a chance against Ole Miss or Oregon? I mean, you got to play the game, so there's always a chance, right? But still, it's not the best teams playing to win the national championship.
Yeah.
I'll stop. But Notre Dame should have been in the tournament. Part of me now wants to root against Alabama and Miami simply because they made it there. But as you'll see in my picks, I haven't done. I want to maintain my perfect record on these games.
Yeah. Well, the great injustices were back in the 90s and 80s. So when Penn State went undefeated in 94 and lost the national championship because everyone wanted to give one to Tom Osborne. I mean, there was no other reason. It was, they were both undefeated. They didn't play each other. You had to choose between them. I get it. But Penn State was, I think, on paper, clearly the better team. But nevertheless, they weren't national champions. So then you had the BCS, the top 2 teams fought it out. Then it was the top 4. By the time we're at 12 or maybe it's top 10 really now, right? Plus 2, or at least plus 1, depending on how the conferences play out. To my mind, all the teams that deserve a shot at the national championship got a shot, right? I mean, if you lost 2 games, okay, you lost 2 games, right? The way to get in the playoff is to not lose 2 games. Now, obviously, some teams got in the playoff that, in the case of Alabama, lost 3 games, right? So there's like the relative comparison and the relative merit. In my mind, no team that loses 2 games has any real complaint about not having a chance to win the championship. You want to go on a run, you could win it. I'm not saying Notre Dame couldn't have won it because they could have certainly gone on a run. They were winning lots of games, playing very well. But if you're not undefeated, in some ways, there's more that you could have done.
For shame. I don't like that argument at all.
Okay.
But I mean, the simple solution, go to 16. Have number 1 play number 16. So have Indiana play, who would it be? Have Indiana play James Madison. Okay. My guess is Indiana is going to be favored by about 32 points in that game.
Yeah.
Likewise, have Ohio State play Tulane. There you go. But no one gets a week off, and you just have 4 weeks of
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
Go from 16 to one.
Yeah.
Uh, all right, it's
All right.
done. All right, so
Okay. Well, we will pick the four games that we have coming up this weekend. So first, number 9, Alabama at number 8, Oklahoma. Oklahoma is a 1.5 point favorite. Give me your winner and give me the margin, Dave.
I say that Alabama wins. Obviously, I don't want to root against them, but I think they'll win pretty handily. They have their best defensive player coming back. Oklahoma has beaten Alabama this year, but I still think Alabama's a stronger team right now. They go in and they figure out a way to get this Ty Simpson on track, and they win by 10 points.
Okay. Yeah, I think they win. I'm going to say by 3. I think it's going to be a close game. It probably teens or low 20s, something like that, kind of defensive struggle. I think a great game, but I'm gonna take Alabama by 3. Okay, number 10, Miami against number 7, Texas A&M at A&M. A&M's a 3.5 point favorite. What do you think, Dave?
I think Miami wins. I really do. I think they go in there and it's going to be a closer game. I may be the closest game of the weekend, but I would give that game to Miami. So I say Miami beats A&M by 4 points.
Okay, this looks like this is going to be our difference. So I'm going to take A&M by 7 at home. I think they've had I think they've got a shot. I think they could make a run here. So I think they start that by taking out Miami, knock the ACC out of the tournament altogether, and then on to, I guess, next up for them would be Ohio State, which will be a challenge. But all right, number 20, Tulane at number 6, Ole Miss. Ole Miss favored by 17.5 points.
I think Ole Miss dominates this game. I know that their coach left for LSU, which is kind of problematic in and of itself.
Right.
But players come out, they've got a chip on their shoulder, and they do so at the expense of Tulane. So this thing may be over, I'd say, in the early second quarter.
Yeah. Okay. I agree with you. I think I've got them by 24. So, uh, covering the point spread and then some. So raise questions about the group of 5 inclusion, I think, and probably not do any favors for that cause moving forward.
Yeah, I'm saying Ole Miss by 30 in this game. That'd be my prediction.
Okay. Even more extreme than me. All right. So
Yes.
last game, number 24, James Madison at number 5, Oregon. Oregon, a 20.5 point favorite. You've already indicated, Dave, you thought it was going to be a blowout. What do you say?
I think it's going to be a shootout, but a shootout blowout. So I'm looking at like a 47 to 27
Okay.
Oregon by 20 game. Maybe the James Madison gets a couple touchdowns in the fourth quarter. They Oregon doesn't cover the spread, which will make a lot
Okay.
of people upset, but I would say they still win by 20 points.
Okay, I'm going to go real big. I think Oregon wins by 31, and just gets on a roll that can't be stopped, and crushes James Madison again. We end up with these questions about just who ought to be in the tournament. Last year, semifinal and quarterfinal rounds were really good games, so we'll see if that happens. But I think this first group might not be that great.
All to say, Matt, I don't know about yourself, but I'll be watching Friday night's game between Alabama and Oklahoma,
Yeah,
and certainly try to catch a little bit of that Miami A&M game
yeah,
early in the day. But when that game's over, I'm turning to the NFL and I'm watching those games because
yeah.
they're actually real games.
Right, right. Fair enough. All right, we're going to leave it there for this week. Thank you as always for joining us. You can reach out to us at democracyinamericatoday@gmail.com. Follow us on YouTube and Instagram. Look forward to talking to you again after Christmas.